What if I told you that the biggest enemy in your life isn't your circumstances, isn't your past, isn't even the people who doubt you? What if it's the quiet voice inside your head that says, maybe tomorrow? The dreams you keep postponing, the discipline you keep negotiating, the version of you that you could become, slowly fading every single day you hesitate. This isn't just another motivational speech. This is a confrontation. Because by the end of this video, you're going to have to decide something. Will you stay who you've been? Or are you finally ready to become who you were meant to be? Stay with me. What you're about to hear might be uncomfortable, but it might also be exactly what you need. By the summer of 1944, the sky over Europe no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. The change hadn't happened overnight. It came gradually, first as distant contrails on the horizon, then as bomber streams stretching from coast to coast, and finally as something far more disturbing. Silver fighters that refused to turn back. On a gray morning in June 1944, at a secured airfield deep inside Germany, a captured aircraft sat under guard. Its polished aluminum skin reflected the overcast sky like a mirror. It didn't look damaged. It didn't look defeated. If anything, it looked impatient. Oberleutnant Walter Wolfram walked toward it slowly. He was not easily impressed. He wore the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross on his chest, an honor earned through blood and repetition. Over 100 confirmed aerial victories. He had fought on the Eastern Front, survived multiple shootdowns, endured wounds that would have grounded lesser men. He had destroyed fighters, not lumbering bombers, 119 enemy fighters to be exact. He was a predator of predators. And yet, as he approached the American machine, he felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel. Curiosity. The aircraft was a North American P-51 Mustang, the fighter that had begun appearing in alarming numbers over the Reich. The airplane that escorted bombers deeper and deeper into German territory. The airplane that no longer turned back at the border. The Luftwaffe High Command had summoned him for a reason. They didn't need propaganda. They didn't need bravado. They needed answers. Why were German losses rising? Why were veteran pilots not returning? What was this aircraft doing differently? Wolfram was here to find out. The Mustang before him was not the result of a lucky capture. It was part of a calculated intelligence effort. Throughout the war, German forces had recovered crash-landed Allied aircraft from occupied territory. Some were too damaged to save. Others were carefully restored, repainted with German markings, and flown by a specialized evaluation unit known unofficially as the Rosarius Circus. These aircraft toured operational airfields. German pilots studied them, flew them, tested their limits. But this was different. This was not about technical curiosity anymore. This was about survival. By mid-1944, the air war had shifted into something brutal and mathematical. The Americans were no longer just bombing Germany. They were hunting the Luftwaffe itself. The Mustang was not merely escorting bombers, it was reshaping the battlefield. And Wolfram, one of Germany's most accomplished fighter aces, was about to sit in the cockpit of the machine responsible. He paused beside the wing and ran his hand along the smooth metal surface. No exposed rivets biting into the airflow. No rough seams. No visible compromise. This was not an improvised war machine. It was something else. And what troubled him most was not that it looked powerful. It was that it looked effortless. He climbed the wing and lowered himself into the cockpit. And the first surprise came immediately. This did not feel like a German fighter. It felt like the future. If you were a Luftwaffe pilot in 1944 and saw one of these silver fighters on your tail, what would you feel first? Fear, anger, or determination? Tell me in the comments before we step into the cockpit and start the engine. The first thing Wolfram noticed was space. Too much space. After years inside the tight, almost claustrophobic confines of the Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Mustang's cockpit felt enormous. In the 109, everything was compressed. Controls close to the body, shoulders brushing against metal, the cannon mounted between the pilot's legs. It was intimate, aggressive, like wearing the aircraft rather than sitting inside it. The P-51 was different. The canopy arched above him in a wide, clear bubble. Visibility was extraordinary. He could see behind him without twisting unnaturally. The instrument panel was clean, logically arranged, almost elegant. Switches labeled clearly, gauges spaced with purpose. Nothing felt improvised. But that comfort unsettled him. Combat reflexes are built on repetition. Muscle memory saves lives. A split-second reaction, a hand moving without thought. That is how you survive a dogfight. And here, inside this American fighter, every instinct he had trained for thousands of hours was slightly misplaced. The throttle felt different. The trim wheel placement was unfamiliar. The seat position changed his perspective. It wasn't wrong, it was just not his. That disorientation mattered, because Wolfram understood something deeply. In combat, hesitation kills. He adjusted himself, studying the canopy frame, the gun sight, the control stick. The Americans had clearly designed this aircraft with pilot endurance in mind. The seat was more accommodating, the layout reduced fatigue, long missions would be less punishing, and long missions were precisely what the Americans were flying. He signaled for startup. The ground crew stepped back. He pressed the electric starter. The Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin V1650 came alive with a deep mechanical growl, smooth, controlled, powerful. Not the harsher vibration he was accustomed to from the Daimler-Benz engine of the Bf-109. And something else struck him immediately. There was no struggle, no ground crew hand-cranking an inertia starter, no physical effort required to build rotational energy. No delay, just a switch. In the brutal winters of the Eastern Front, German mechanics often fought frozen engines with sheer manpower. Oil thickened. Starters resisted. Every sortie began with effort before it even reached the runway. Here, the engine responded instantly. The Merlin was producing nearly 1,600 horsepower in combat settings. It featured a two-stage, two-speed supercharger that automatically adjusted with altitude. No manual mixture corrections, no delicate management under stress. The aircraft compensated for the pilot. This wasn't just engineering, it was philosophy. The Mustang reduced pilot workload. It allowed focus on tactics rather than mechanical babysitting. At 25,000 feet, where bomber escort missions were flown, that difference could determine who had the mental clarity to make the first move. Wolfram advanced the throttle gently as he taxied. The aircraft rolled smoothly. No rattling, no oil streaking across the cowling, no subtle signs of mechanical fatigue. German fighters were high-performance machines, but by 1944, spare parts were scarce, maintenance rushed, and production strained under Allied bombing. Even the best units were flying aircraft patched together from worn components. The Mustang, by contrast, felt factory new, consistent, reliable, and reliability in war is a weapon. He reached the runway threshold and paused. This was no longer theoretical analysis. Now he would feel how it climbed, how it responded under pressure, how it hunted. He pushed the throttle forward. The acceleration pressed him back into the seat. Smooth, controlled, linear power delivery. No violent torque swing. No wrestling the aircraft to stay centered. And within moments, the Mustang lifted into the German sky. Wolfram was flying the enemy. And for the first time, he began to understand why so many of his comrades were not coming home. If you had to choose in combat, raw aggression and tight handling, or comfort, visibility and endurance, which would you trust your life to? Let me know what you think before we take this aircraft higher. As the Mustang climbed, Wolfram watched the altimeter carefully. 10,000 feet, 15,000, 20,000. The engine note barely changed. That was the first revelation. In the Bf-109, altitude was always a negotiation. The Daimler-Benz engine was powerful, yes, but above certain heights, performance began to taper. Supercharger stages had to be managed carefully. Power delivery shifted. The aircraft demanded attention. The Mustang did not. The two-stage, two-speed supercharger of the Merlin adjusted automatically. As air density decreased, the system compensated without requiring the pilot to think about it. Power remained steady, smooth, predictable. At 25,000 feet, the altitude where American bomber streams crossed into Germany, the Mustang was not gasping for performance. It was thriving. Wolfram pushed higher. 30,000 feet. The controls remained firm but responsive. The aircraft did not feel strained. It felt composed, stable in a way that suggested it had been designed specifically for this altitude band. That realization carried strategic weight. The Luftwaffe had grown accustomed to a pattern. American fighters would escort bombers part of the way, then turn back due to fuel limitations. German interceptors would wait. They would conserve strength until the escorts left. Then they would attack the bombers with coordinated force. That system had worked, brutally well, but the Mustang had broken it. With external drop tanks, the P-51 could escort bombers deep into the Reich, all the way to Berlin, all the way to targets the Luftwaffe once considered unreachable by single-engine fighters. And it could stay. Wolfram leveled off and advanced the throttle further, allowing the aircraft to build speed in level flight. The Mustang accelerated cleanly. Above 320 miles per hour, something became very clear. This aircraft loved speed. The airflow over its laminar flow wing reduced drag significantly compared to conventional designs. Even if real-world conditions rarely achieved perfect laminar performance due to dirt, damage, or manufacturing tolerances, The aerodynamic efficiency was undeniable. The aircraft felt slippery. It sliced through the air. The Bf-109 was agile at lower speeds, deadly in tight, controlled engagements. But at high speed, particularly above 25,000 feet, the Mustang maintained energy exceptionally well. Energy is life in aerial combat. An aircraft that retains speed after a maneuver dictates the next move. It decides whether to engage or disengage, whether to climb vertically or dive away. Wolfram initiated a shallow dive. The Mustang accelerated rapidly. The airframe remained stable. He pushed further. In high-speed dives, many fighters approached compressibility effects, the dangerous region near transonic speeds where airflow disruption could cause buffeting, control stiffening, and even structural failure. The Mustang's critical Mach number was slightly higher than that of the Bf-109 and FW-190. That small difference mattered. At extreme speeds, the Mustang pilot could retain control just a little longer, maintain authority just a little deeper into the dive. Recover with greater confidence. In a vertical escape, that edge could mean survival. Wolfram eased the aircraft out of the dive and considered the implications. This fighter did not need to outturn the Bf-109 in a low-speed spiral. It did not need superior cannon armament. It only needed to choose when to fight. And increasingly, it was the Americans who chose. Another realization followed quickly. Endurance. The Bf-109, depending on configuration, could fight for roughly 90 minutes before fuel became critical. Interception missions were short and intense. There was no margin for prolonged engagement. The Mustang, by contrast, could remain airborne for up to 7 hours with drop tanks. 7 hours. That meant American pilots could sweep ahead of bomber formations, engage interceptors before they formed, loiter near airfields, pursue damaged aircraft, return with fuel to spare. This was not merely a fighter. It was an offensive instrument designed for sustained pressure. The Luftwaffe had been built for rapid interception and defensive response. The Mustang had been built for relentless reach. And reach, in 1944, was everything. As Wolfram banked gently over the German countryside, the disturbing truth began forming in his mind. The P-51 was not unbeatable in a duel, but it was unbeatable in the larger equation. And wars are not decided by duels. They are decided by systems. At this point, if you were in command, would you change tactics, or would you try to build something even better? What do you think Germany's real mistake was in 1944? Share your thoughts before we examine how this aircraft changed the entire strategy of the air war. Wolfram brought the Mustang down to a lower altitude to test something every fighter pilot understands instinctively. Turning ability decides who survives the first mistake. He reduced throttle slightly and entered a sustained turn. The control forces were balanced, not overly light, not heavy, predictable. At moderate speeds, the aircraft held its line well. The Laminar flow wing, though optimized for speed, did not betray him in controlled maneuvering. It maintained lift cleanly without sudden stall behavior. But this was where the comparison grew interesting. The Bf-109 had automatic leading-edge slats that deployed at low speeds, allowing it to sustain tighter turns near stall conditions. In a slow-speed turning fight, particularly below 250 mph, the German fighter could gain an advantage. Wolfram knew this intimately. He had survived countless dogfights by forcing enemies into vertical and low-speed engagements, where the 109's climb rate and stall characteristics gave him leverage. So he deliberately slowed further. The Mustang responded well, but it was clear that this was not its preferred regime. It could turn tightly, yes, but it did not feel as comfortable at the edge of stall as the Bf-109. Then he increased speed again. At higher speeds, the difference reversed. The Mustang retained energy through the turn more effectively. Its heavier, more stable airframe allowed it to maintain momentum in wide, high-speed maneuvers. It did not bleed speed as rapidly. It did not feel fragile under G-load. This was critical, because American pilots were increasingly trained not to enter prolonged low-speed turning fights. They were taught to keep speed, dive, zoom climb, extend away, and re-engage on their own terms. Boom and zoom tactics, energy fighting. The Mustang did not need to outturn the 109 in a tight spiral if it could simply refuse that type of fight. And that was the deeper issue. Choice. The American pilot in a P-51 often had the option to disengage. With superior high-altitude speed and range, he could break contact and reset the fight. German pilots rarely had that luxury. They were defending their homeland. They had limited fuel. They were often outnumbered, and increasingly they were less experienced. By early 1944, attrition was carving into the Luftwaffe's veteran corps. Pilots with hundreds of combat hours were irreplaceable. Training programs were shortened. Fuel shortages limited flight time for trainees. New pilots entered combat with a fraction of the experience their predecessors had enjoyed. Meanwhile, American pilots often arrived over Europe with 300-400 flight hours. Skill gaps widened, And when those less experienced German pilots faced Mustangs flown by confident, well-trained Americans, in aircraft that rewarded patience and energy discipline, the outcome became predictable. Wolfram rolled the Mustang level and reflected on something unsettling. The P-51 was not a miracle machine in any single category. It did not dominate every turning fight. It did not carry heavier cannons. It did not climb faster than the Bf-109 in all conditions. But it combined enough advantages, speed, range, altitude performance, reliability, visibility, into one coherent package. It was balanced, and balance wins prolonged wars. Then came the most sobering conclusion of all. The Mustang was not merely protecting bombers anymore. Under new American leadership, escort fighters had been given permission to hunt. Instead of clinging tightly to bomber formations, they swept ahead. They intercepted German fighters before they could organize. They attacked airfields. They strafed aircraft on the ground. They pursued damaged planes relentlessly. The Luftwaffe was no longer fighting bombers. It was fighting predators. And the Mustang was built for that role. Wolfram banked once more, imagining dozens, even hundreds, of these aircraft operating together. Not just one evaluation flight, not just one squadron, hundreds, because that was the other reality. American factories were producing Mustangs at astonishing rates. Entire formations could be replaced quickly, losses absorbed, numbers restored. Germany could still build excellent aircraft, but it could not replace experienced pilots fast enough. The Mustang did not need to win every fight. It only needed to keep the pressure constant. Because in a war of attrition, mathematics is ruthless. If you were a young German pilot in 1944, knowing you had limited fuel and limited experience, would you fight aggressively or conserve and survive? What would you choose? Tell me before we step into the strategic consequences of this aircraft. There was a moment, not marked by a single explosion or a dramatic speech, when the illusion collapsed. For years, German leadership believed distance was protection. The deeper industrial cities, Berlin, Leipzig, the synthetic fuel plants, aircraft factories, were thought to be difficult, if not impossible, to reach with effective fighter escort. Bombers could come, but bombers alone could be destroyed. And they were. In 1943, unescorted American heavy bombers flying into the heart of Germany suffered catastrophic losses. Entire formations were shredded by coordinated Luftwaffe attacks. The message seemed clear. Without protection, the bomber offensive could not be sustained. Then the Mustang arrived in numbers. And everything changed. With two external drop tanks, a P-51D could fly over 1,600 miles. That range allowed escort missions from England to Berlin and back, with fuel reserves. For the first time, American fighters were not peeling away at the German border. They were crossing it. They were staying. On early long-range missions, German interceptors climbed expecting the usual pattern. Escorts withdrawing, bombers exposed. Instead, they found Mustangs waiting. Over Berlin. That psychological impact cannot be overstated. When silver fighters appeared above the capital itself, it shattered more than tactical assumptions. It shattered confidence. The Luftwaffe could no longer time its attacks safely beyond escort range. There was no longer a safe zone inside the Reich. German fighters climbing to intercept bombers were now intercepted themselves, often before they could even form up. This forced a brutal shift. German pilots had to fight earlier, harder, against fighters designed to hunt them, and every engagement drained the Luftwaffe further. Wolfram understood the implications immediately. The Mustang's greatest weapon was not speed, not climb, not maneuverability. It was reach. Reach turned defense into vulnerability. Reach meant the Americans dictated tempo. Reach meant every German takeoff risked immediate engagement. And reach meant that attrition accelerated. Because once the Mustang could escort bombers anywhere, American strategy evolved. Escort pilots were no longer restricted to tight defensive patterns. They were unleashed. They swept ahead of bomber streams. They attacked German formations as they assembled. They strafed airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground. They pursued damaged fighters until fuel or gravity ended the chase. This was not merely protection, it was systematic destruction of an air force. And it worked. During concentrated offensives in early 1944, large percentages of Germany's experienced fighter pilots were lost in a matter of weeks. Aircraft production continued, but pilot quality declined. Training hours dropped. Fuel shortages worsened. By mid-1944, many new German pilots entered combat with barely 100 hours of flight time. Their opponents often had 3 or 4 times that experience. The outcome became increasingly one-sided. Even the greatest aces, men with hundreds of victories, found themselves leading squadrons of frightened novices who might not survive their first week. Wolfram, who had once been surrounded by seasoned veterans, began seeing the shift firsthand. Numbers were no longer in Germany's favor. Experience was no longer in Germany's favor. Endurance was certainly not in Germany's favor. The Mustang did not defeat the Luftwaffe overnight. It exhausted it. There is a difference. One is dramatic. The other is inevitable. And by the time German high command fully understood what the P-51 represented, the equation was already turning against them. The Mustang was not invincible in a duel, but in a sustained campaign of pressure, range, and production. It was devastating. And Wolfram knew his report would say exactly that. If you had to name the single most decisive factor in air warfare, speed, skill, technology, or industrial capacity, which one truly decides the outcome? I want to hear your perspective before we look at what the Luftwaffe tried to do in response. When Wolfram delivered his evaluation, he did not exaggerate. He did not dramatize. He simply laid out the facts. The P-51 Mustang was not unbeatable in a one-on-one dogfight. A skilled German pilot in a Bf-109 or FW-190 could still win, especially at lower altitudes, in tighter turning engagements, or by exploiting climb performance. But the problem was no longer the duel. The problem was the system. Still, the Luftwaffe had to respond. They could not surrender the skies without resistance. So tactical recommendations were issued. Engage quickly. Avoid prolonged turning fights at high speed. Force combat to lower altitude when possible. Exploit vertical maneuvers where climb rates offered advantage. Break contact early if energy state deteriorated. In theory, these were sound tactics. In practice, they were increasingly difficult to execute. Because the Mustang pilot often entered combat with three critical advantages: altitude, speed, and fuel. Altitude meant initiative. Speed meant choice. Fuel meant patience. German pilots were defending. They scrambled to intercept incoming bombers. They climbed under time pressure. They burned precious fuel reaching engagement altitude. Often, by the time they made contact, they were already operating on a limited clock. Mustang pilots, by contrast, could loiter. They could patrol above the bomber stream. They could dive into engagements with energy advantage and climb away again. The vertical dimension, once a trusted escape route for German fighters, was no longer guaranteed safety. The Mustang's high-altitude performance meant it could follow longer, remain effective longer, and disengage safely if needed. Even more troubling was what happened after the fight. American doctrine had evolved. Escort fighters were no longer chained to bomber wings. Under new leadership, they were encouraged to seek and destroy German fighters wherever they could find them. This meant strafing airfields. It meant attacking aircraft during landing approaches. It meant hunting damaged fighters attempting to limp home. The sky above Germany had become hostile in every phase of flight. Takeoff, climb, combat, return. There were no longer safe moments. And this constant pressure accelerated attrition. Germany still produced advanced designs. The FW-190D, the Bf-109K, even revolutionary jet aircraft like the Me-262. Technologically, innovation had not stopped. But jets required trained pilots. They required fuel. They required airfields not under constant attack. And those were precisely the resources dwindling fastest. Wolfram understood something many others did not want to admit. No tactical adjustment could compensate for overwhelming material advantage combined with endurance. Even when German aces shot down Mustangs, and they did, replacements arrived. American losses could be absorbed. German losses could not. Mathematics was eroding experience. And experience is the currency of air superiority. By early 1945, the average German fighter pilot entering combat had dramatically less training time than his counterpart from 1942. Fuel shortages limited flight hours. Aircraft were delivered faster than crews could properly master them. Meanwhile, American training pipelines remained steady, well supplied, and insulated from the immediate devastation of the battlefield. The Mustang symbolized this imbalance. It was not just a fighter. It was an extension of an industrial machine operating beyond the reach of German bombers. That reality weighed heavier than any technical comparison of turn radius or cannon caliber. Wolfram had flown the aircraft. He had felt its strengths. He knew that in isolation it could be countered. But war is not isolation. War is accumulation. And accumulation was no longer in Germany's favor. If you were designing a fighter in 1944, would you focus on building the absolute best machine, or the one that could be built in the greatest numbers, which matters more in total war? Share your view before we examine the industrial lesson behind the Mustang. By the time Wolfram finished his evaluation, the most troubling conclusion had little to do with aerodynamics. It had to do with factories. Because the P-51 Mustang was not simply a well-designed fighter. It was a product of an industrial philosophy radically different from Germany's. German aircraft, particularly early war designs like the Bf-109, were engineered as precision instruments, compact, high performance, optimized for speed and climb. But they were also difficult to manufacture, labor-intensive, and increasingly complex as wartime modifications accumulated. The Mustang was different from the beginning. It was designed not only to perform, but to be built efficiently in enormous numbers, with consistent quality. Its wing, revolutionary in aerodynamic theory, was also structurally straightforward. A trapezoidal planform with straight leading and trailing edges simplified tooling and production alignment. The airframe was modular, divided into major sections that could be assembled separately and joined efficiently. Wiring and plumbing were installed before major assembly, speeding final integration. Damaged aircraft could be repaired by replacing large sections instead of painstakingly reconstructing individual structural members. This mattered because by 1944, American factories were producing Mustangs at astonishing rates, over 100 per week at peak output. More than 15,000 Mustangs would be built during the war. Even if a mission cost dozens of aircraft, replacements flowed steadily from production lines thousands of miles away, untouched by enemy bombing. Germany, meanwhile, faced the opposite reality. Strategic bombing campaigns increasingly targeted aircraft factories, synthetic fuel plants, transportation hubs, and infrastructure. Production was dispersed, relocated underground, fragmented. Skilled labor grew scarce, supply chains strained. Germany still produced advanced fighters, even extraordinary ones, but production consistency and logistical resilience declined. And pilots? They could not be manufactured on an assembly line. Training programs shortened under pressure. Fuel shortages reduced flight hours. New pilots entered combat with dramatically less experience than their predecessors. The Mustang exposed that imbalance brutally. It was not simply superior in certain performance categories, it was replaceable. And replaceability is decisive in attritional warfare. Wolfram may have admired aspects of the aircraft, its engine reliability, its stability at altitude, its endurance, but what likely unsettled his superiors most was this. The Mustang represented a war economy functioning at full capacity. It embodied scale. German fighter design prioritized individual excellence. American fighter production prioritized systemic dominance. In 1940 and 1941, tactical brilliance and experienced pilots had carried Germany far. By 1944, scale was determining outcomes. Even revolutionary technologies, such as jet fighters, could not compensate for insufficient fuel, insufficient pilots, insufficient time. The Mustang required none of those miracles. It required steady production and disciplined doctrine, and both were available in abundance. Wolfram's evaluation therefore contained an unspoken truth. The Luftwaffe was not being defeated solely by better machines. It was being defeated by a better system. And systems, once in motion, are extraordinarily difficult to stop. Do you think technological innovation alone can win a war? Or does the ability to sustain production matter more in the long run? I'm curious where you stand before we move into what happened to the men who tested these aircraft. When the war finally collapsed around them, the aircraft remained, but the pilots carried the scars. Walter Wolfram survived. That fact alone was extraordinary. By the end of the conflict, he had amassed 137 aerial victories, the vast majority against enemy fighters, not slow bombers, but opponents maneuvering, shooting back, and fighting to survive just as desperately as he was. He had been shot down multiple times, wounded repeatedly, forced into emergency landings, thrown into the chaos of a collapsing front. And yet he endured. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Wolfram's unit laid down its arms in what was then Czechoslovakia. The war that had defined his youth ended abruptly, not in triumph, but in exhaustion. Many German pilots were transferred to Soviet captivity. Some would not return for years. Some never did. Wolfram, weakened by injuries, was released comparatively quickly. But survival in war does not mean immunity from its consequences. For men like him, the sky had been both battlefield and identity. After the war, grounded air forces dissolved and military aviation restructured under strict limitations. Germany itself was divided. The world had changed permanently. And yet, for some former fighter pilots, flying was inseparable from who they were. Wolfram returned to the air, not in combat, but in competition. He became an aerobatic pilot, mastering precision flying in peacetime skies. Years later, he would win national championships and continue flying long after the guns had fallen silent. There is something striking about that transformation. From high-altitude dogfights over oil fields and bombed cities, to graceful aerobatic displays before civilian audiences. The machine that once symbolized survival became an instrument of sport. Another figure who tested captured Mustangs, Günter Rall, followed a different path. He too survived the war, one of the highest-scoring fighter aces in history. After years of captivity, he eventually joined the reformed West German Air Force in the 1950s. He would rise to high rank in a completely new military structure aligned with former adversaries. History has strange turns. Men who once faced Mustangs in combat would later cooperate with Western allies in rebuilding European air defense. And decades later, when interviewed about the P-51, Rolls spoke with remarkable candor. He did not dismiss it, he did not minimize it, he acknowledged its endurance, its cockpit comfort, its engine reliability, its suitability for long-range offensive war. That honesty stands out. Professional respect between former enemies. Both Wolfram and Roll lived long enough to reflect on what they had experienced, and both recognized that by 1944, the Luftwaffe was fighting a battle it could not sustain. The Mustang was part of that realization, but it was not hatred that defined their memory of it. It was recognition. Recognition that technology, training, and production had shifted the balance irreversibly, and recognition that aerial warfare had entered a new era. The men who once tested captured enemy aircraft would become living bridges between worlds, from total war to Cold War, from piston engines to jets, from rivalry to uneasy cooperation. The sky remained, but the meaning of flying changed forever. Do you think former enemies can truly respect each other after a war, especially when they've faced each other in combat? I'd like to know your thoughts before we move to the lasting legacy of the Mustang itself. When the guns fell silent in 1945, many aircraft vanished into scrapyards. The Mustang did not. Instead, it began a second life. During the war, P-51 pilots were credited with destroying thousands of enemy aircraft in the air and on the ground. But its real legacy was broader than statistics. It had helped secure air superiority over Europe, and air superiority shaped everything that followed on the ground. Yet the Mustang's story did not end in victory parades. It flew again in combat during the Korean War, redesignated as the F-51. Though jet fighters were now taking center stage, the Mustang's long range and endurance made it valuable for close air support missions. Once again, it proved adaptable, not the fastest anymore, but still effective. Other nations continued operating the aircraft for years. Some air forces flew Mustangs well into the 1970s and even beyond. For an aircraft conceived in the early 1940s, that longevity was extraordinary. But perhaps its most enduring transformation came in peacetime skies. The sound of the Merlin engine, that deep rising roar, became iconic, not a sound of fear anymore but of heritage. Across the United States, Britain, and beyond, Mustangs were restored, polished, and flown in air shows. Pilots who had grown up hearing stories of the war now had the chance to sit behind that bubble canopy and feel the same aerodynamic smoothness Wolfram once described as disconcerting. Hundreds still fly today. They are no longer instruments of attrition. They are flying history. There is something symbolic about that. An aircraft once representing industrial dominance and total war now represents craftsmanship, preservation, and memory. But beyond nostalgia, the Mustang changed how fighter aircraft were evaluated. It demonstrated that range could be decisive, that endurance could redefine strategy, that comfort and reliability could be combat multipliers. That mass production combined with sound engineering could overwhelm even highly skilled opposition. Modern fighter doctrine, emphasizing energy management, high-altitude performance, logistics integration, and sustained operations, owes part of its lineage to lessons learned during that era. The Mustang did not win the war alone. No single machine ever does. But it reshaped the conditions under which the war in the air was fought. And when German aces, men who had survived hundreds of engagements, admitted its effectiveness, that acknowledgement carried weight. Because praise from a rival in war is not given lightly. It is earned. And in 1944, the P-51 earned it. If you could witness one aircraft from history flying at full power overhead, which would it be? And why? I'm interested in what machine represents the pinnacle of aviation to you before we bring this story to its final reflection. When Walter Wolfram climbed into that captured Mustang in 1944, he expected to analyze an enemy. He did not expect to glimpse the future. What unsettled him, and later his superiors, was not that the P-51 was perfect. It wasn't. No aircraft is. It had limits. It could be outturned under certain conditions. It could be shot down. German aces proved that repeatedly. But that was never the point. The point was what the Mustang represented. It represented reach, the ability to project power deep into enemy territory without compromise. It represented endurance, 7 hours in the air versus barely more than 1. It represented reliability, engines that did not leak oil, systems that started with the push of a button, machines that returned from missions intact more often than not. And above all, it represented scale of production, scale of training, scale of logistics. The Bf-109 had been a brilliant interceptor for a different phase of war, a weapon of rapid response and tactical precision. But by 1944, the nature of the conflict had evolved. It was no longer about isolated engagements, it was about sustained pressure. The Mustang allowed American strategy to shift from protection to domination. Bombers were no longer bait, they were escorted instruments of strategic transformation. German fighters were no longer hunters waiting at the edge of escort range. They became prey, intercepted while climbing, pursued while retreating, attacked even while landing. Wolfram's understated assessment that it was a fine airplane may have been the most revealing judgment of all, because coming from a man with 137 victories, from a pilot who had been wounded 4 times, from someone who had survived emergency landings and intense dogfights, fine was not casual praise, it was professional recognition. And recognition from a rival carries a unique weight. The P-51 did not single-handedly end the war in Europe, but it altered the balance in a way that made reversal increasingly impossible. Air superiority is not won in a single day. It is worn into existence through attrition, endurance, and relentless presence. By the time Mustangs were flying over Berlin regularly, the outcome in the air was no longer in doubt. And when Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring reportedly saw them overhead, he is said to have realized what that meant. Not just tactically, but strategically. The skies had shifted. Today, when a restored Mustang roars across an airfield, it no longer carries bombs or ammunition. It carries memory. It reminds us that wars are not decided only by bravery or individual brilliance, though those matter. They are decided by systems, by logistics, by industry, by endurance. Walter Wolfram stepped into a captured enemy aircraft seeking weaknesses. What he found instead was a mirror, reflecting the changing nature of modern war. And in that reflection was a truth that could not be ignored. The P-51 Mustang was not just another fighter. It was the machine that changed the rules of the air war. If this series gave you a new perspective on how technology and strategy shape history, tell me what surprised you most about this story. And if you'd like more deep dives into the machines and minds that defined World War II, let me know which story we should explore next.